Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? This is, I missed last week, but this is just great to see. In fact, you saw me taking some pictures of it. No, we've been wondering, we've been hoping to kind of increase attendance, and there's an obvious cause and effect here. And I'm actually really glad we've done this. A few years ago, the OHSU budget was tight. They were encouraging departments not to spend money on frivolous things like food at conferences, but clearly this is worth it. Anyways, however, a couple things. Because it's so crowded in here, this is some feedback I got last week that because there's so many people in here, you might be tempted to lean over and say something to someone next to you, and when multiple people do that, the noise level starts to rise. So please be respectful of the speaker. I was also asked that people spend too much time checking whatever they're checking on their device in front of them. I would be hypocritical if I said to you, don't do that at all, because I will probably peek down at my device once or twice during the talk. But just don't overdo it, and give the respect that our speaker deserves. And speaking of our speaker, probably all of you know Dr. David Dorr, who's a member of our faculty in DMICE. He's actually vice chair of clinical informatics, and for the last year or so, I don't know the exact amount, has also taken on a new role here at OHSU as chief research informatics officer, which is not only great for him, but it's actually great for the university to have someone in that role who's really focused on informatics issues in research. And in fact, that's the topic of his talk today. So as I always do, give a little bit of biographical information. Dr. Dorr actually grew up in the Portland area. He went off to college and medical school at Washington University. He then came to OHSU to do his internal medicine residency. Actually, that's when I first met him. And he expressed an interest in informatics. We were hoping he would stay on and be an NLM fellow, but he got lured away to the University of Utah, where he did an informatics fellowship there. Very wonderful, excellent program. And then he, as he was finishing that, came back and joined our faculty, and he's worked his way up through the ranks, professor and vice chair in CRIO. So I will turn it over to David.
Yeah, thank you. So in the beginning of this talk, I actually talk about what a CRIO does, which is different. There's actually some papers around it, but don't worry if you've never heard of this role. It's actually not that, well, it's increasingly common, but wasn't that common 5 years ago, for instance. Sort of people have recognized using data, information, and knowledge in research has gotten incredibly complex, and yet is necessary for most people who do research, and so that's why we have that role. I'm actually trained as an internist, so I'm a physician by training, and many people in these roles actually have PhDs, because there's a whole set of issues around sort of the basic science of data. So people who use very large data sets that are often freely available, like some genomic information that's sort of protected in different ways, and some other sort of large-scale data sets. I deal with that too, but I'm not going to talk about it today. We know of a number of issues related to managing and dealing with that kind of data here. But I'm mainly going to talk about some of the clinical, the sort of translational aspects of the research, and specifically about there's a huge transformation going on in terms of trying to make things more available, more interoperable for research, for innovation, not just at OHSU, but across the country. And so I'm going to sort of talk about that and then reflect on what we're trying to do here at OHSU. We actually just received word a month or so ago, 2 months ago, that in the strategic planning process that I hope some of you participated in, we have a research informatics funded effort that's supposed to go over the next 5 years to 2025 that I'll allude to. So we're very excited about that, and it's just the right time to get your input. So I hope that you sort of talk to me about your issues as well. And my contact information's here. So what do I do in this role? It's actually half my time. The rest of the time I do research, actually, and do clinical care. But as CREO, I really try and figure out, in a research informatics perspective, what are we missing? What would help researchers and innovators at OHSU do their jobs better in regards to data, information, and knowledge? And then I try and pull that together into some kind of vision, always sort of evolving that vision, or at least how we're approaching that vision. But this is sort of the vision we came up with, and I'll talk very specifically about these. So the first one is about OHSU becoming a learning organization and a learning health system as well as part of that. And I'll talk very specifically what that means, but it means we use data and analyze it and think about it, and then do tests of change in our everyday care, in our everyday work here. And there's some great examples of that. We also, many of you focus on analytics or data science, sort of the really hardcore computational stuff, and that we have many strengths in that, but we're not really seen nationally as a consistent leader. It's more episodic. How can we become that leader? And then what can we do to sort of enhance the services that are available to people here doing research around information technology? And then also, finally, and maybe in some ways most importantly, research now requires much more collaboration and sharing, and there's a natural tension between protected health information or restricted information and making data more available, open, making what we do, sharing it with others. And so my goal is to sort of make things more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable through things like licensing and better agreements for people, so that we know. And I have many partners in this that I won't name all of them, but we work together to basically manage this. So I sort of sit, one thing about me is I don't really manage a whole group. I just work with lots of people. I actually manage my research group, I guess, but I work with lots of people. So there are many touch points, and I work really hard to try and have really good relationships with them. And so if you come to me and say, how do I get something like X done? That's something that I really am focused on here, actually, is understanding the solutions to challenging problems in research. So, you know, I work a lot with Oaktree. We have some Oaktree representatives here, like Rob and Amy. Work at the library that is not on here. I'm sorry about that. That's Chris and Robin. And I work, of course, with fellows come and rotate with me, as well as more of the health system side. That I try and work with them as they're doing innovation. And then I work externally, so there's lots of relationships we have with organizations and entities. There's lots going on with U of O and OSU and PSU, as well as with national labs and with people across the country. And so I try and build those more strongly because it's so crucial to do research. My research is closely aligned with some of the examples that I'll give you, but we focus on how we can use data, information, and knowledge to transform health for especially vulnerable populations. What do I mean by that? Populations that maybe aren't currently well served by our society or healthcare system. So we focus on social determinants of health. We focus on complex illness, advancing illness, identification of risk, and then how we can address that better in the care we deliver and improve outcomes for folks. So we do a lot of that. I won't talk much about that here, but come and talk to me. So what is evolving sort of nationally and here around, especially data first? That's what I'm going to focus on. And then I'll talk about algorithms, and then I'll talk about learning organization. So as I said, research really has transformed in its requirement to have data. Compared to, so I sit on a couple of study sections for reviews, and compared to when I sort of started doing research, the expectation that people will present data analyses in their work has just grown. It is an expectation that you will have some prior data in your larger grants everywhere, and more data. It's expected that you'll have access to it. But getting access to that data can be challenging because of what I talked about. So we really have to think about how we govern, because there are many laws like HIPAA and actually other ones that control how we can release data, but there are ways to get access to it. So I help with that, and we're actually starting up a research data governance committee, which hasn't existed here for a while, to manage this. We also think a lot about how the EHR data can facilitate research, because that's the other thing people who submit to the NIH frequently, if it has a clinical and translational component, how do you have access to your EHR data? How can you use it? We have a research data warehouse here that gets that data and transforms it and makes it available with lots of services for you. And so how can we continue to offer those up and make the experience of doing that better? We also have ways that you can leverage our EHR to do your research. You can build things within it, or you can interface using tools. We also have to bring some data together. How can we better integrate data and make it available for people? And then how can we share and collaborate? So I'll give you some examples of the kinds of data that many people want to get access to now. And in each of these, I list this little, like in the top one, PA 17077. That is a very specific call that requires this kind of research data from the NIH. So if you want to just enter those into a search browser, you will find that call and say, oh, why do we need patient-reported outcomes? These are outcomes that are specifically the perception of people, pain, their degree of symptoms related to a particular illness, their overall quality of life. And those are really important outcomes that we don't collect in clinical care, yet are incredibly important to understanding how we're doing and to run studies on how we can improve. So that's a kind of data we don't have ready access to. How can we work on that? Social and behavioral data, I think you all know, have heard about health-related social needs or social determinants of health are a huge predictor of our health over time, yet we don't often collect these or have these available at the individual level, and we're working on ways to doing that. As well as we often don't know, if you're studying people in the health system, if you're extracting that data, we're missing lots of their data. We don't know their outcomes, because if they were here and then they went somewhere else, they passed away there, or they had a significant event there, we don't have that data necessarily. And so how can we help researchers have more complete data sets when they're studying that? So there has been a huge number of efforts to manage this and bring together in more standard ways and make accessible across institutions data that address these. And I want to encourage you to go and look at these and figure out if any of them relate to them, with the caveat that the data quality, the fitness for use for your research for this data really needs to be tested before you use it. But I'll give you some examples to really pull this in, and some new ways to access that data as well. So there are now all these extremely large databases that are federated, meaning they're not stored in one place, but there are ways to get access to large amounts of that data through various ways. So Sentinel and Mini Sentinel, which comes actually out of the FDA, which sort of regulates our drugs and trials, now has a huge number of people who submit data on effects of medications, and that's used in lots of studies, including real-world data evidence for new trials. The FDA is exploring an incredibly fun area that they're doing. That's almost 200 million people's data is in that. PCORNet, which is actually a patient-centered outcomes focused network, has about 65 million patients. We have one in the Portland metropolitan area that we participate in called Advance. And these are to do trials of people with people actively participating in setting up the trial and managing it to understand population-level outcomes. Accrual to clinical trials, which is more focused on clinical and translational science awardees, like our own Oak Tree here, has about 40 million people, and we participate in that. You can actually go on the website I'll show later and sort of see how that works if you're a clinical trialist. And then the one I'll talk most about, which has roughly about 500 million people's data mapped into this data model is called UMOP. And the organization that sort of manages it is Odyssey. And I'll show you some examples. So here's them. We don't actually, I've actually done a mini OMOP instance, but this is not sort of at OHU, but this is actually accessible. They have de-identified data sets that you can actually use. And there are hundreds of collaborators. There's a central a sort of forum that they all sort of participate on. And they basically come from lots of different places. Historically, this is much more pharmaceutical industry focused, but it's really been transformed. And I'll show you what they can do with this. So this is on a study that's a subset of the total, 240 million patients, that basically subsetted the type 2 diabetes, T2DM, and then looked at what drugs they were being treated with, both alone, only drug, and then with 2 or more drugs overall. In the sunburst plot, that's from the, my reference isn't on here, sorry, it's from Herbsack from the PNAS. And basically he looked at this, and if you do work in this area, this is amazing to understand what's happening with patients. Well, they also have outcomes for patients, and sorry, that's a little bit small, but I use this to train residents because we had a new diabetes med that came out, sodium glucose linked transporters, and there was some trials that said, hey, I think these seem to improve not just diabetes outcomes, but also cardiovascular outcomes like congestive heart failure. And then they took 5 large databases mapped into OMOP, and they ran cohort trials, a retrospective cohort trial comparing people who had been given that drug with similar people with similar conditions and other treatments with those who hadn't, and said, in fact, yes, the rate of congestive heart failure for all those patients is much lower. So we can do these kinds of studies much more effectively using this kind of tool. And they did this not only in type 2 diabetes, but hypertension and depression. And so if you have an interest in this area, then these are great ways to sort of test out some initial hypotheses. We have a new high blood pressure study, so hypertension is particularly interesting to us. And one thing we see when we look at the guidelines is there's not a lot of comparisons against individual drug classes for how they help with high blood pressure, avoiding the bad outcomes like heart attack and stroke. So here is something from George Herbsack as well, the LEGEND study, where he said, look, the RCTs really don't do these pairwise comparisons, but with us, we can actually show that there's some improvements in outcomes with certain classes of these medications, like ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers, over other classes of medications, and we can start to test these overall. So this kind of model is amazing for doing some clinical research. It does have its caveats, though, and so here he says, are thiazides really better than ACE inhibitors? Probably not physiologically, but something's probably different about those patients. There might be a selection bias there. So that kind of data is more available than ever, and under a big piece of legislation that came out, the 21st Century Secures Act, we're trying to make data from EHRs against all these models. This is a slide from the Center for Data to Health, the CD2H. Many of you participate in that. That basically says, how can we make the data exchangeable so we can act on it no matter where it comes from? It's stored in many different formats right now, and it can't easily be exchanged. And so we're doing this in part through FHIR, which is Fast Healthcare Interoperable Resources. And under this legislation, it basically says you have to open up your data to these kinds of application programming interfaces via FHIR APIs and make it available to patients, at the very least, with no extra effort. It means they can't be charged for it in general. And then that standardization also transfers over to many research activities as well, because now we can set up applications that ask many different sites for their data once they agree to send it, pull it all together, and do these kinds of large studies much more easily in the future. So we are exploring that here in a number of ways. we have turned on our patient-facing fire. We have a couple of applications, but many sites are already sort of en route to doing this because it's required. So at OHSU, what are we doing around this? We're testing, piloting, not yet available for widespread consumption. Oh, no, this one is actually available, a tool called Clinical Pipe. And the use here is to basically, if you're running a study with lots of sites, the sponsor of the study can say, use this tool, and then we'll set it up, and then it will send the EHR data out to this. And every time you go in to look at it, it'll sort of tell you about all your study participants, and here's all the data we have on them, and then you can improve that and send it off to the trial. So compared to hours and hours of searching through the chart and checking to see if new data has come in or getting reports episodically, now you can sort of do it automatically. And a similar tool through our institutional research survey application called REDCap is piloting this in a couple different ways. I highlight one called Clinical Data Pool, where you set up a survey and then you connect it, specific data elements to the patient's records, and then it pulls the data over time for your studies. It's kind of an amazing concept for those of you who do clinical work, and we've been testing it. Jen, one of the clinical informatics fellows, has sort of did a test with it to see how it's working. So we're sort of in the piloting stage. So we sort of welcome more people to help us understand it. The real problem with that data is now you could potentially just set up your connections to everywhere, pull all the data out, but you're not really sure what you're getting still. So here's a study we did, and Nicole Weisskopf, I should say, generated this complex-looking thing, but EHR data is captured largely for billing and documentation purposes. It's not captured for research, so the precision doesn't always match the need. And what's more complex is here we queried about 18 common chronic conditions that might be important to people. And we said, we had vetted and approved, sort of validated sets of ICD-9 and 10 codes for diagnoses. And then we went into the charts for these and said, how often are these really backed up by the formal diagnosis of this illness? And we found, first off, about 30% no evidence that this diagnosis really was in this patient chart. It had been done for billing, or it was just sort of a piece of data that had no additional backup, so not good enough for most research purposes. And then we found you can find these diagnoses in a problem list at the patient level, in encounters where they see a particular provider, in their medical history where somebody might have mentioned this or put a code in. You can do phenotypic rules, like for diabetes, if they have an A1C above a level, or you can put them all together. And we actually found, in general, the best for finding the most diagnoses was just combining them all for sensitivity, but very poor specificity. So really, if you're thinking about that for your own work, you really need to be testing that. And Nicole Weisskopf is our local expert in data quality. She has a K grant in it. She can tell you about this in general. So what are we planning to do to make it easier for you to get access to this data? Well, we're exploring using different techniques to getting this data. And I'll tell you very explicitly, for patient-reported outcomes, this is actually a big institutional need. The health system needs this data for a lot of the things they do. So we're convening a big group to basically code and make this data available, and then we'll publish the way that you can get access to this data about how people are doing over time, including getting directly from the patients themselves, which is crucial overall. For social and behavioral data, we did some studies in using natural language programming. My team, Matt, and others participated in that to understand how we could get that at the individual level. Pretty good precision on that, actually about 0.9 for most of the concepts using a relatively straightforward approach. And then we're trying to get access to additional data through the strategic planning to enhance what we have so it's more reliable and useful for research. And we wrote a grant related to that we're going to be submitting in the next couple months to basically highlight how we can add this data to understand people's health outcomes over time. So we also do this work ourselves. So here's what we do, and we have a tactic leader here, Rob, in one of these. We're transforming our research data warehouse to basically plan to get this data in here to do just the kind of things I described, as well as improving our high-performance computing environment. And we also are working for basic science, building a research data network that allows people with high throughput, high volume, non-restricted data to move it more easily. So, which is already funded and led by Mandy Terrell as of right now. So we're working on this. We'll take data that you'd like to integrate or problems, use cases. Come and tell us about it because it's just the right time. So moving on, this one's going to be a little bit easier for you because I presented it to people who didn't know much about analytics initially, but I thought it would be useful to understand that. So in healthcare in general and in pursuit of health, we're using a lot more analytics. We're using a lot more artificial intelligence and other more specific machine learning techniques to try and understand how we can provide better care, how we can understand people's health over time. Many of you do this, how we can predict illness. And we need to really think about, when we're doing this, how we bring the right data together, how we test it and build reusable, available tools, and then how we show it to people, because it's hard sometimes for people to understand this. And in fact, OHSU has a statement on artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence, where we're like, if people can't understand how it got there, then that's a much higher bar for presenting a prediction to clinicians, and we need to really think hard about how we do that, or patients. For those of us who are not heavily into sort of computation, the number of analytic techniques, and this is from a specific domain, but I thought it was really useful, is just daunting. The number of terms here for machine learning algorithms and approaches is really hard for people to understand. Yet every day now, health systems get approached by AI companies that promise to do something amazing for them. How do we sort that through, and how do we create really good ones? Because there's some problems. So I'll give you some examples of where this is going forward fast. So imaging. Now in imaging, especially deep learning convolutional neural networks, have a number of instances where they can at least do as well as humans in diagnosing disease. So here are chest x-rays, where it basically took a number of diagnoses from chest x-ray, including normal, and they compared it against a set of radiologists for an F measure, an average of precision and recall, for how well it got the right ones, true positives and true negatives. And basically, it performs slightly better than the average overall, although not statistically significantly better for this algorithm. Now, this is a really complicated neural network, 121 layers, so it's not easy to implement, but it's sort of amazing to us in the field. As well, we have people here that work on this problem. Mike Chang here is leading an effort to do this for images for retinopathy of prematurity. For when you're premature as a baby, you have a risk of having a particular syndrome where you have can have low vision through your life if it's not appropriately treated and diagnosed. It's a difficult problem to treat, and they used a similar approach to both segment and classify through convolutional neural networks, images, and vessel maps to predict whether they were definitely had retinopathy of prematurity or were in sort of this in-between state. And so, once again, they did slightly better, maybe not statistically significantly better, than experts, at least comparable using this kind of technique. So this is like hugely important, in part because the ophthalmologists who can do this aren't always so easy to find. And so if you can pre-screen the images with an algorithm. We also, at OHSU, are really interested in exploring this. So we're working on a number of prediction rules, not just in imaging, but we use this to risk stratify people who come here for primary care. It's required by law for something we do here, and we try and improve our algorithms all the time to better match work, so we're doing research in that. As well, for chemotherapy dosing, we just submitted an application to PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, on outcomes using lean muscle mass derived from CT scan images by algorithm to dose chemotherapy, almost always a little bit lower than using body surface area or body mass index, which has is usually higher, and yet the chemotherapy drugs are really determined in part. Their effectiveness and potential harm are determined by how much lean muscle mass you have. So we've never had good indices of these, so we're trying to develop a way to automatically generate that on all our patients and then run a trial to see if we could do that, if we're funded. So Dan Marks and Charlie Lopez are the PIs of that, if you know them. We also have a group that's doing this, Peter Graven operationally, and then, of course, we have biostatistics within Oaktree, a core, as well as a computational faculty. We also are very aware of the bias that exists in the algorithms. So this is a paper from Science that if you have not seen, I would highly recommend you read. And in this study, which is really good, there's a common algorithm that tries to predict who will be the top 3% of overall cost and utilization in the next year. It's got pretty good metrics around its performance. At UCSF and at other places, they use this to determine who will get extra resources to try and mitigate those risks. Makes sense. They found that at UCSF, for their African American patients, they had worse outcomes, but were not in this top 3% because they couldn't get access to health care to generate those costs and utilization because the health system itself had kind of a bias. They didn't have as good access, and so this algorithm was basically biased against them in a way and not including them in this work. And they raised this flag, and it's generated a lot of discussion, including, because we do primary care risk stratification here, a big discussion about are we worsening equity. And I think that's incredibly important. The National Library of Medicine also has a grant for methodologies, a notice for methodologies in addressing this. And I think if you're interested in this area, I think Nicole Weisskopf also is submitting something around that, or you could talk to us. Incredibly important. So, all right. So then finally, learning health systems. How can we sort of understand every day the care we deliver and the health of our populations that we serve and improve it? So this is really from Chuck Friedman, who has long been at Michigan, an informatician of note, who really said, you know, we should be using our data all the time to generate new knowledge and understanding, and we should put that knowledge into practice and measure it. So we should see how we're performing compared to evidence. So we have the EPC here that does this and is really interested in closing this loop, and then look at that performance and constantly be measuring how could we be improved, what are we missing overall. And in a way, this sort of takes operations and brings them more closely to research. And let me give you an example of a place that does this well. This is, I think this was an informatics fellow, Dr. Self, at Vanderbilt, basically ran this huge trial, two trials actually, one in the ED, which is this one here, the emergency department, and one in the ICU, to say, okay, if you're a non-critical adult in the ED and you need fluid, should we give you normal saline, or should we give you balanced crystalloids that sort of match your current electrolyte mix? And they basically used the EHR, and every month switched to different default for what they recommended to clinicians giving these fluids. And after they enrolled 13,000 patients in this trial over the time period through this opt-out default, they said they found out, yeah, balanced crystalloids better, about 1% better outcomes in adverse kidney events, so kidney injuries, within 30 days. And so they said, this is the new standard of care. These are amazing, transformative kinds of things you can do with good, that randomization by time is a very good way to look at this because it sort of evens out over time. And the recruitment of 13,000 patients is amazing. Like, to do that in a trial is amazing. So this is something we're very interested in understanding here and using in our own evaluations. Leora Horwitz, who was at Yale and now has been at NYU for some time, I came up with her in sort of a similar group, has been testing this using randomized controlled trials at NYU for the last period of time when they try and say, how can we improve smoking cessation? How can we address gaps in recommended preventive care or increasing the number of people that we're monitoring for wellness? They study these heavily, and then they basically make decisions about the research that's done from the randomized trials or other trials that they do on what's really effective and not. And so it's a wonderful idea, and there's so much work in getting that data ready and running those trials that it's just a wonderful way to start bringing more data. If you're more quantitative, like you're more into omics type data, I'll give you an example. For predicting who will have a heart attack or stroke in the next year, 5 years, or 10 years, both proteins and genetic risk is an incredibly important part of that, but we don't use it to predict risk. Instead, we sort of treat people without knowing that with sort of average risk by populations. And so one way you could do this is say, when I add in that other risk indices to patients, do I see better outcomes? Can I now prevent more people from having a heart attack or stroke? And that's, right now, we should be doing that, but we need to work on that. We have a learning health system here through a K-12 that Jean-Marie Gies here, and at Kaiser, Lucy Savitz. Co-PI, we have Dana Womack is our fellow here, if you know her. And this is a great initiative because there's so many local institutions participating on it. She's been looking at workplace strain and potential for error and harm to patients when nurses on the floor get overwhelmed with the number of things that are given to them and their attention is drawn in different ways. And how do you address that? So a wonderful thing that really is the institution's very interested in that. And she basically uses unusual data types that, like using the automated sort of communication tools, the Voceras, and then looking at the information from the EHRs for how many people are delivering medications over time and who's delivering the medication to understand potential outcomes like unplanned overtime and stress and strain reported by the nurses. So, Michelle, your slides, I apologize. Michelle also, Hubar, who you may know here, also looks at audit log information to understand how we could improve our use of the EHR in general and specifically for scheduling certain patients or the patterns of use. And so I had a version with your slides in it, and I apologize that they weren't in here, but sort of amazing stuff there. So what can you do now? You all are, interested at least in informatics because you're here. So one is this K-12 has people always coming, applications you could sort of apply if you really want to get in the field and work with an institution. On that, Oaktree is a key site, and they recently redid their webpage, and it's great. You can now find things much more easily, and you could talk to Rob Schuff, who's here, head of the RDW and the clinical research informatics group there, about sort of what you need. There are a number of services that are available to trainees, and you can really use those effectively. Like I said, there's a number of 2025 efforts, not just in research, but actually there's a whole effort in digital health here that's ongoing, and the institution's really going to that. Lots of opportunities there. There's a team that does transforms Epic called Epic for Research Team. I'll show you a little bit about them. You can contact them and something if you're interested in using Epic for your research. That's much more like I'm trying to change Epic or interface. You'd put a FHIR application into Epic, you'd talk to them. So the Epic for Research team, they do a lot of best practice alerts for recruiting. They send MyChart messages, the portal-based messages for recruiting. It's Rachel and Dina currently. They do the FHIR app implementation. So if you have a FHIR app you think will transform the world, then you can talk to them, and we can sort of work together to try and figure out a pathway to get that in. And they also do research orders. There's 3,000 research orders monthly, so those are all done in Epic for the most part overall. So finally, and then I'm going to open it up for your questions or thoughts, Steve Kasakian here, and Bill's on the committee, and probably several other youth we're having an Inventathon, which is the sort of in the MIT Hacking Medicine approach, where basically over a weekend, May 1st through 3rd, you get together and you try and solve problems in healthcare. They're focusing on sort of device, med tech, and then digital health and health IT, although I think you're refining the use cases, so there'll be an update on this. If you're interested in that, save that date. There'll be ways that you can get involved in that. A fun weekend from everything that I have heard. So that's it. Now, let's open it up and get your real questions out overall. So thank you so much. No questions.
This is sort of a broader, maybe just a vague question, which so my research interest is in learning health systems, location-based data, and data integration. So could you talk about, I noticed in your talk you were looking at social determinants of health using NLP. Is there some reason to use that instead of a zip code? Is that superior, or what kinds of things are you looking at for the social determinants of health using NLP?
So when you say location-based, you mean like geographic or aerial measures?
Geographic,
yeah. So there is good, so if we think about using models based on census tract or zip code for individual, for an individual prediction, that it is, those are, if you just use zip code and they have like percent of people in poverty or percent educational attainment in that zip code, those are really useful to predict, even at the individual level, a person's course in a particular treatment or their additional needs. So that's really valuable work. And in fact, you can use that data lots of different ways. One of the AMIA student best papers used GIS to do a whole bunch of different comparisons to identify groups that they might want to focus in on in the Philadelphia area, and it was amazing. So good, you can combine all these different data together. For a number of the efforts that we have, we want to know that this person in front of us actually has this issue. So it's really different if you're tailoring an intervention. And there's a study that just came out of Boston where they basically had patients with diabetes. They ask a suite of questions, which is sort of the way this is being done, about their, do you have food insecurity? Do you have housing insecurity? These kinds of social determinants. And then if they had food insecurity, they helped connect them to resources, and they also they helped them find a diet that could work given their lack of ability to get expensive food, which often the healthier options can be more expensive. So they actually tailored the approach there, and they showed that people had some better outcomes, especially about hypoglycemia. So I had a patient like this in my clinical practice, and he was on insulin, and he would run out of food each month. And he would have hypoglycemia, and he'd fall, and he actually didn't have a house. He was housing insecure. He lived in a van, and so we had to work through a bunch of these issues. And so sometimes you need the geographic is good enough because you can sort of plan resources or make predictions, but sometimes you need the individual. And for our studies, we're really trying to understand what was happening with individuals over time, especially as some groups from Vanderbilt found out that housing insecurity really varies over time. For some people, that they actually get some more stable housing, or you can see this, and so using the EHR, you can actually see, is that status changing over time as people get access to resources? So you could really do a longitudinal look and see the outcomes of your effort. So just a different place in the research arena. Other questions? Chris has a question. Oh, no, go ahead. No, you're right there. Chris can be next.
I just had a question about the imaging analysis studies where they showed that they were about as good as a physician, maybe even better than statistics. This is totally different. My question was if the percent that was inaccurate, were there more false positives or false negatives?
Yeah, that's a good question because I just present the F measure here. So it depends on the problem. So let's go to chest x-rays. So the vast majority of chest x-rays are negative. So they're taken routinely. They don't show anything. It's just sort of normal overall. And so I believe in that study there are much more false positives overall, but including for radiologists as well. So overall. But it really depends on sort of your underlying prevalence and the problem that you're trying to address. In this one, it's a little bit complicated because there's also misdiagnosis. So they say, oh, they have a pneumonia, but really they had a fusion or something like that. So they actually looked at 8 different diagnoses overall. But it really depends on sort of the underlying prevalence of the organization. But it's sort of amazing given that because it's easier for a radiologist actually to know a little bit about the clinical case and have a prior probability and then make a more accurate diagnosis, whereas the machine learning techniques sort of do that, but not. They mostly focus on the images, sort of the actually processing the images. But that's a big issue actually because I didn't say this, but I almost always say this. An algorithm that works at one setting, you cannot assume it's going to work at the new setting, in part because of those differences, not just in the data, but the underlying patient populations as well. And we have seen that in some of these. So when we get a new request for a machine learning algorithm, we have to revalidate it basically every time still.
So the question I was going to ask is about the patient-centered outcomes work at OHSU that you were mentioning.
Yes.
Might go forward. And I was curious, given that there's such a plethora of patient-centered outcomes that we should use, is there any sense of looking at what patient-centered outcomes OHSU researchers have already studied and published on to maybe prioritize getting some of those patient measures into the literature so that if people are doing follow-up studies or different studies, comparative studies, that we're already focusing on the ones we've already tried to do before using non-informatics methods?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I would say a high level of establishing a system to better work on patient-reported outcomes is as follows. So at OHSU, we're actually taking that approach. So I'm doing a very much inductive approach where we find use cases where people are working on this. For example, the Spine Center has long been collecting pain and function reported outcomes. They have developed a system where actually people report those and then they put them into some kind of tool to then, not Epic really, I mean they put them into Epic, but to manage and understand the data they have to use these other tool sets, and like they're an easy group to prioritize because they want to do this and study it and improve it. And there's a balance in a way because we have, I don't know, 6 or 7 of those use cases we've already collected. But the validity of the underlying patient-reported outcomes in studies is pretty variable, actually, even in the ones done here. And so we have to balance this sort of feasibility, pragmatic approach with sort of what is the most valid, scientifically acceptable way of doing this. But in general, I would usually push from a socio-technical point of view to say if somebody's really interested in monitoring and measuring and has already been doing research in it, it's so much easier to make a difference because they're going to drive that human element and get people to do it, because you could build all the patient-reported outcomes infrastructure in the world and send them out to patients without sort of a team focused on getting that data and using it. It just isn't likely to be successful. But we are looking at ways to make it easier. We're going to send many more requests out to patients as they sign up to enter this data before they come in a structured format. So we are exploring different ways to get at it, and there's a whole art and science in that sort of area as well. And so I think we need to study that as well. Yeah. Oh, no, Dion, whoever's next.
Yeah, go ahead.
Please. Sorry. Yeah, so we do have funding under the Research Informatics. It is not enough to transform the entire endeavor. So I think that's a good question, actually, to think about, which is where will the funding come from to do this? And actually, in my examples, I try and focus a little bit on, as we deliver care, what should we be looking at to sort of the health system should invest in, because it's incredibly important. And there is some interest in that. So I anticipate that there will be some ongoing funding for evaluation related to the health system components. We're going to build more infrastructure, and so a really long-term outcome for us is more research funding. Could be from industry. I mean, industry is very interested in building tools and applications that can be useful to people, and there's some work already done in that for phenotype. Bill and Aaron have been working with precise computable phenotype work for, what is it? Porphyria, acute intermittent porphyria. So, and that company has a drug to treat that. So, and that's good, because it's something that's underdiagnosed. So I think it will be from a variety of sources. NIH is very interested in this. So I think from a research perspective, it's a clear opportunity for us and a loss if we don't do it. So that's one place. The total amount of funding, I don't know, but I think that we'll have enough to really get some use cases and improve the tools that we have, for sure. Okay, who's next? Maybe this guy, and then you could say your name so I don't have to call you this person.
Yeah, so Chris,
I shouldn't use guy, so my apologies. This person.
Yeah, so a bit of a selfish question, but relative, you mentioned a moment ago about the socio-technical connection of you have these clinical practice guidelines, you have patient-reported outcomes. The other half of that circle of really going from having the knowledge and using it, how much of the focus is on that now, this kind of the socio-technical implementation piece versus the capturing the data and making sense of the data?
Yeah, I'm focused more on doing better at capturing and making sense of the data, because I know there's so many problems there. However, OHSU has some amazing strength because we produce the evidence. We sort of help people write guidelines through the EPC, or at least get the systematic reviews out that then are used for the guidelines. There's a bunch of effort going on in that regards, and in our new high blood pressure grant, we're like plugged into that. So if you think about a guideline, it is not computable. It is all narrative recommendations. How do you go from there to make it logic and the sort of underlying data elements that would drive implementation of those? That is happening. And we are, through that process, using something called CPG on Fire, Clinical Practice Guidelines on Fire, to go all the way down that path. It is weird. It is not, many of the recommendations cannot be put in. And so we've sort of ended up, for hypertension, there's 8 guidelines, we have 71 recommendations, and we're like, oh God, we can't do all of those. So there's really a prioritization process for what knowledge should be transferred. And so one of the things that we look at is where's there's a real gap. We know we're not doing well at this. We could actually measure it, it's feasible, and we try and prioritize those. So there's effort in that. I think there's ongoing desire in clinical transformation to do better at getting knowledge into performance, but it's still a gap. It's a wonderful group. CDC does a bunch of work in this and has had funding in it in the past, so that's an unusual group that does focus on that.
David Sanders, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm interested in public health interoperability.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, you mentioned FHIR, and I know that the coordination app that you've been working on. So I'm interested to know, are there existing connections with outside databases that might be related, say, the state, or involvement in data systems for social services or educational things like that? I know that the funding for researching that kind of stuff is not nearly as much there, but sometimes there really are some uses, and you can convince legislators to pay for it.
Yeah, so the CDC as well is working on that in a project called MedMorph that is looking specifically at the public health components. The connections are pretty rare, as you know. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We wrote a grant that was not funded to basically enhance those connections, because in Oregon, coordinated care organizations that serve the Medicaid population have a community role that where they basically need to work with those social service agencies. And we're still talking to them about, could we build something that would be more beneficial to get that data across. There is a program called the Accountable Health Communities that is tracking data on social determinants and then sending it to different sites, including social service agencies. And there's navigators that can help people with that. And then there's a program called Unite Us that is a FHIR-based application that is being looked at. I haven't heard more about it recently to connect these as well. I don't know its overall functionality, if it's really well integrated or not into the agencies, but that's improved dramatically over the last 10 years. So I bet in the next 5, we're going to see a much better infrastructure. And I think it's a great area to work because the mission of people in it is so wonderful, trying to provide these incredibly important services. And they've historically been left out of this information loop, just paper forms largely. So I think it's a good area, but MedMorph is directly looking at this and may be a good one to follow.
Okay. Maybe a bit of an ignorant question, but I was wondering what proportion of solutions you see coming from like the corporate world, Googles and GEs, and how that plays into what's homegrown at hospital systems.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for asking that question. It's about like how much are corporations doing this, industry doing this, versus how much is actually coming from on the ground, from health systems, from academicians. This is a huge issue for us actually right now. And the reason is, so there's a ton being done in industry. And I don't know if you've seen recently, but Google's like buying tons of hundreds of millions of medical records, like from Cerner and other people. And they actually had a study where they worked with UCSF and University of Chicago to predict, I think, mortality and hospitalization in the future. And then somebody sued them because they had actually their GPS location data and could actually, from that data, re-identify them. So I think there's a ton of venture capital money going into this. There's a ton of hype. There's a ton of money, and lots of places groups are focusing on this. What they lack is really good insight into the issues on the data that I described, but also the way the system works. Like, it's really hard to understand the way the healthcare system works or doesn't work, and the sort of pitfalls they might have, and the way, all this complication around the medical language and how it's coded. And so I see an incredibly important role for health systems and innovators within them or academia to work on this. That being said, I mean, most of the money, I think, is going to industry. We just have to figure out a way to collaborate to help them have the best outcomes, because they're going to be more selling directly to patients, like patient-facing tools and applications, and we need to help make sure those are safe. FDA is going to regulate more of those. I'm not sure how I feel about the scope of the regulations. It's still in draft, but I think it's an open question. It's probably the question of the decade, to be honest, for me. We have one more, or should we? Somebody's texting me.
You had mentioned something about randomized quality improvement projects.
Yeah.
At one point, I was wondering to what extent the providers, like the nurses and staff that are implementing this, how much they're aware of what's being done with the EHR recommendations over time, whether or not they're blind to it or they know this is happening, and they've bought into it. They're proponents of this.
Yeah. That's a good question. I've done a pragmatic clinical trial, a couple of them actually, and for most of them we consent care team members, the providers, the clinicians, the other team members, because they have to be aware. And blinding is a huge issue. So if you think about, there's 3 opportunities to blind: the person who sees it, the study investigators, not including the analysts, and we can only blind to the analysts because they're seeing something different. But this clustering, this is an art in pragmatic trials, and it is a challenge. So I think that's a very good question because there's some bias, right? I mean, you're being shown something different. However, you can really limit that bias in a bunch of different ways. I think ethically, who you should consent is really important. You know, in general, I think we've mostly focused, if we're going to present something potentially different to you, even if it's just information, we try and consent you under our studies because I think, you know, one, we need to know your perspective on it, whether you've noticed it or things like that, but also, you know, ethically, we need their buy-in. So, all right. Thank you.